The man they were hunting had a 3-day head start, no fixed address, and a territory the size of France to disappear into. In the spring of 1881, somewhere between the Arizona Territory and the Mexican border, a fugitive named William Brocius, better known as Curly Bill, had already slipped through the fingers of Cochise County's fledgling law enforcement apparatus twice. And the question that nobody at the time could fully answer, and that historians are still arguing about today, is this: how on earth did frontier lawmen catch anyone at all? Because when you actually look at the conditions these men were working in, the wonder is not that so many outlaws escaped. The wonder is that so many were brought in. There were no telephones in most of the West until the late 1870s, and even then coverage was laughably thin. There were no fingerprints on file, no mugshots in most jurisdictions, no centralized records, no radios, no forensic labs. A sheriff in Dodge City, Kansas, trying to track a man who had just robbed a stagecoach outside of town, was working with roughly the same investigative toolkit as a medieval constable. He had his horse, his eyes, the testimony of frightened witnesses, and whatever network of informants he had spent years carefully cultivating. That was it. And yet men like Wyatt Earp, Pat Garrett, Bass Reeves, and Bill Tilghman managed to track down some of the most dangerous fugitives in American history, across hundreds of miles of open, hostile, largely unmapped terrain. The story of how they did it is not the story Hollywood told you. It is stranger, smarter, and considerably more complicated than a quick-draw showdown in a dusty street. To understand how tracking worked on the frontier, you first have to understand what the frontier actually was, and that word is doing a lot of heavy lifting. The United States Census Bureau officially declared the frontier closed in 1890, meaning that by that point there was no longer a continuous line of settlement below 2 people per square mile stretching across the country, but for the decades between roughly 1860 and that 1890 declaration, enormous swaths of the American West were legally and practically ambiguous spaces. The land had been taken from indigenous nations through a combination of treaty violations, military force, and deliberate starvation campaigns. New settlers were pouring in along routes like the Santa Fe Trail and the Oregon Trail. Cattle drives were pushing north from Texas through Oklahoma and Kansas. Mining camps were exploding into existence overnight in Colorado, Nevada, and the Black Hills of Dakota Territory. And into all of this chaotic, rapidly shifting human geography, the federal government was trying to impose legal order with almost comically inadequate resources. Here is a number worth sitting with for a moment. In 1870, the entire law enforcement apparatus of the Arizona Territory consisted of fewer than a dozen appointed officials with jurisdiction over roughly 113,000 square miles. That is 1 lawman for every 10,000 square miles, give or take. The state of Connecticut would fit inside that territory about 37 times, so when we talk about a sheriff tracking an outlaw, we are not talking about a man with backup units and a radio dispatch. We are talking about one man, maybe a deputy or two if he was lucky, riding into a landscape that actively conspired to hide the people he was looking for. And if you find that fascinating, if you want to understand what really happened out there beyond the mythology, then stick around, because this channel exists for exactly that reason. We dig into the documented record, the letters, the court transcripts, the newspaper accounts, the memoirs, and we find the story underneath the story. That is what we do here, and the people who subscribe are the ones who want the real version. Now back to the desert. The first and most essential tool a frontier lawman had was not a gun. It was local knowledge. This sounds obvious until you realize just how systematically these men cultivated it. Wyatt Earp, before he ever pinned on a badge and tombstone, had spent years working as a buffalo hunter, a teamster, a gambler, and a sometime lawman in Wichita and Dodge City. Every one of those roles gave him something invaluable, a network. He knew saloon owners, he knew cattle buyers, he knew the men who ran the brothels, and the men who supplied the brothels, and the men who drank in the brothels and talked too much. When Earp needed to find someone, he did not ride out into the wilderness and start looking at boot prints. He went to the people who always knew where everyone was, because in a frontier economy, information was currency and everyone was trading it. Pat Garrett operated the same way in his pursuit of Billy the Kid. William H. Bonney, or William McCarty, depending on which historian you ask, is one of the most instructive case studies in frontier tracking, precisely because it was so methodical. By the time Garrett was appointed sheriff of Lincoln County, New Mexico in November of 1880, the kid had been operating in that territory for years. He had friends everywhere. He had safe houses. He had people who would feed him, hide him, and lie to law enforcement on his behalf without hesitation, because in Lincoln County, the law itself had been thoroughly corrupted during the Lincoln County War of 1878, and a lot of ordinary people had more reason to trust Billy than they did to trust any badge. Garrett understood this. He did not try to outrun the kid or outshoot him in open country. He spent months quietly flipping the network. He talked to people. He offered assurances. He made it clear, carefully and privately, that cooperation with him was safer than loyalty to a fugitive whose luck was running out. And it worked. In December of 1880, acting on intelligence gathered from that network, Garrett intercepted the kid at Stinking Springs, New Mexico, and captured him after a brief standoff. The kid was not caught by brilliant tracking across open terrain. He was caught because Garrett knew who was feeding him and where. But network intelligence only got you so far, and here is where things get genuinely interesting. Because the frontier was not just one territory. Outlaws moved. They crossed county lines, territorial lines, and international borders with a freedom that lawmen simply did not have. A sheriff's jurisdiction ended at the county line. A territorial marshal's authority ended at the territorial border. And the moment a fugitive crossed into Mexico or into Indian territory or into an adjacent state, the pursuing lawman was in a legal gray zone that could get him killed, arrested, or both. This is where the concept of hot pursuit comes in, and it was applied on the frontier in ways that would make a modern legal scholar's hair stand on end. Lawmen routinely crossed jurisdictional boundaries in pursuit of suspects, operating on the informal understanding that catching the man mattered more than the paperwork. Pat Garrett himself crossed into Texas without formal authorization during his pursuit of the kid. The Earp brothers, during their famous vendetta ride in the spring of 1882, after the murder of Morgan Earp and the crippling of Virgil Earp, pursued the men they held responsible across much of southeastern Arizona territory, operating with a federal marshal's commission that was legally questionable at best. They were simultaneously lawmen and, depending on your perspective, vigilantes. The line was that thin, and it was thin by design in a way. The federal government wanted order in the territories, but it did not want to pay for it. Sheriffs were often paid by the fee, a set of amount for each arrest, each warrant served, each prisoner transported. This created a system with some deeply perverse incentives. A sheriff who made a lot of arrests made a lot of money. A sheriff who spent months tracking one fugitive across 3 territories might end up bankrupt. Some lawmen gamed the system by arresting people for minor offenses they knew would generate fees. Others supplemented their income in ways that blurred the line between law enforcement and the criminal enterprises they were supposed to be suppressing. The career of Henry Plummer, who served simultaneously as sheriff of Bannock, Montana Territory and as the alleged leader of a road agent gang called the Innocents in 1863, is the most extreme example of this. But the underlying pressure, do more with less or find other ways to make the numbers work, was universal. Here is the twist that most people do not expect. Some of the most effective tracking on the frontier was done not by white lawmen, but by black deputies and indigenous scouts, and the historical record has been systematically slow to acknowledge this. Bass Reeves, a formerly enslaved man who became a deputy U.S. Marshal in the Indian Territory in 1875, is by any reasonable measure one of the greatest lawmen in American history. Over a career spanning more than 3 decades, he arrested more than 3,000 felons and killed 14 men in the line of duty, always according to the documented record, in self-defense. He operated across 75,000 square miles of Indian Territory, modern-day Oklahoma, with a methodology that was strikingly sophisticated. He used disguises. He cultivated informants among the 5 civilized tribes, whose nations controlled Indian Territory and who had their own complex relationships with federal law. He spoke several indigenous languages. He was, by every account, essentially impossible to ambush because he was so careful about his approach routes and his intelligence gathering before he ever moved on a target. The outlaws who operated in Indian Territory knew his name and feared it, which is itself a form of intelligence advantage. The use of indigenous scouts by the U.S. Army and by civilian law enforcement is a separate and even more complicated story. Apache scouts working with the Army during the campaigns against Geronimo in the 1880s were performing tracking work of a sophistication that no Anglo lawman could match. They could read terrain in ways that were essentially invisible to outsiders: a disturbed stone, a partial print in caliche hardpan, the direction a branch was bent, the age of a fire's ash. General George Crook, who commanded the Department of Arizona during two separate periods, was one of the few Army commanders who genuinely understood this and built his strategy around it. His use of Apache scouts to track other Apaches was controversial among his superiors and among settlers who found the whole arrangement unsettling, but it worked. When Geronimo finally surrendered in September of 1886 at Skeleton Canyon, it was in large part because Crook's successor Nelson Miles, who had dismissed many of the Apache scouts, had spent months failing to catch him, while the scouts had repeatedly gotten close enough to negotiate. The telegraph changed everything, and it changed it faster than most people realize. The transcontinental telegraph was completed in October of 1861. And within a few years, a web of lines was spreading across the frontier along the same routes as the railroads. By the 1870s, a sheriff in Abilene, Kansas, could send a message to a colleague in Denver or St. Louis in minutes. This sounds modest by modern standards, but in the context of frontier law enforcement, it was revolutionary. Suddenly, a fugitive who had ridden hard for 3 days was not necessarily safe. The description of the man, his horse, his companions, and the direction he was heading could reach the next town before he did. Wells Fargo, which operated its own private detective force, one of the most effective law enforcement organizations in the West, used the telegraph aggressively to coordinate pursuit across multiple jurisdictions. Their chief detective, James B. Hume, built a filing system of wanted men's descriptions, known associates, and operating patterns that was arguably the first systematic criminal intelligence database in the American West. Wells Fargo's approach deserves a longer look because it represents a genuinely different model of frontier law enforcement. The company had a direct financial interest in catching stage robbers and train robbers, which meant it could spend money on investigations that cash-strapped county sheriffs simply could not. Hume's detectives would spend months, sometimes years, on a single case. They followed money. They tracked where stolen gold went, who was buying things they should not have been able to afford, which saloons were suddenly flush with cash after a robbery. They cultivated paid informants on a systematic basis, something that most county sheriffs could not afford to do. When the notorious Black Bart, Charles Bowles, a genteel former Union Army officer who robbed 28 Wells Fargo stagecoaches between 1875 and 1883 while leaving behind handwritten poetry at the crime scenes, was finally caught. It was because of exactly this kind of patient, methodical financial and physical evidence tracking. A laundry mark on a handkerchief found near the scene of his last robbery led Hume's detectives to a San Francisco laundry, which led them to a rooming house, which led them to Bowles himself. No dramatic chase, no gunfight, just detective work, painstaking and unglamorous. The railroads were both a tool and a complication. On the one hand, they allowed lawmen to move much faster than any horse. A deputy who needed to get from Kansas City to Dodge City could do it in hours rather than days. On the other hand, the railroads were also the primary target of the most sophisticated outlaw operations of the era, and the men who robbed them were adapting their methods in real time. Jesse James and his gang, operating primarily in Missouri and the surrounding states between 1866 and 1882, were among the first to systematically target trains rather than stagecoaches, precisely because trains carried more money and because the railroad's predictable schedules made them easier to plan against. The James Younger gang's methods were also specifically designed to exploit the jurisdictional chaos of the frontier. They would strike in one county, cross into another before any pursuit could organize, and disperse into a social network of Confederate sympathizers and family connections that made informants almost impossible to develop. The Pinkertons, hired by the railroads to pursue the gang, spent years and considerable money trying to break that network. Their January 1875 raid on the James family farm in Clay County, Missouri, during which a bomb or incendiary device thrown into the house killed Jesse's young half-brother Archie and blew off his mother Zerelda's arm, was a catastrophic failure that generated enormous public sympathy for the James family and made the Pinkertons look like murderers. It was a lesson in how not to conduct a manhunt, and it set the pursuit back by years. What finally brought Jesse James down was not superior law enforcement. It was betrayal from within his own network. Robert Ford, a young man who had been admitted to the inner circle of the reconstituted James Gang in 1881, shot Jesse in the back of the head at his home in St. Joseph, Missouri on April 3, 1882, in exchange for a promised pardon and reward money from Missouri Governor Thomas Crittenden. The governor had been working with the railroad companies to fund the reward, in an arrangement that was itself legally murky and politically explosive. Ford was convicted of murder, pardoned the same day, and spent the rest of his short life being reviled as a coward. He was shot dead in his own saloon in Creede, Colorado, in 1892. The man who shot him, Edward O'Kelly, gave no clear motive. Some things on the frontier remain genuinely mysterious. The pattern that emerges from all of these cases, Garrett and the Kid, Reeves in Indian Territory, Hume and Black Bart, the Pinkertons and Jesse James, is that the most effective frontier law enforcement was almost never about physical tracking across open terrain. The Hollywood image of a lone lawman following hoofprints through the dust is not entirely wrong, but it is profoundly incomplete. The real work was social. It was about networks, information, patience, and the slow, unglamorous process of turning someone's allies into someone's enemies. The frontier was not empty. It was full of people and people talk, and the lawmen who understood that fundamental truth were the ones who succeeded. There is a darker thread running through all of this, and it would be dishonest to ignore it. The law on the frontier was not neutral. It was a tool of a particular social and economic order, and who it protected and who it pursued reflected that order with uncomfortable clarity. The same territorial legal system that deputized Bass Reeves also enforced the laws that stripped indigenous nations of their land and confined them to reservations. The same sheriffs who tracked cattle rustlers often looked the other way when large ranching interests committed their own forms of theft and violence. The Johnson County War in Wyoming in 1892, when a group of large cattlemen hired a small army of gunmen to murder suspected rustlers and smaller ranchers, is the most dramatic example of this, but the underlying dynamic was everywhere. The law followed power, and the people who existed outside the protection of that power, indigenous people, black settlers, Mexican Americans in the borderlands, Chinese laborers in the mining camps, experienced frontier justice as something quite different from the romantic narrative. The long-term consequences of how the frontier was policed are still with us in ways that are not always obvious. The jurisdictional chaos of the territorial period drove the development of federal law enforcement in ways that shaped institutions we still have today. The Secret Service, founded in 1865 to combat counterfeiting, expanded its role repeatedly in response to frontier conditions. The Bureau of Investigation, which would become the FBI in 1935, grew partly out of the recognition that criminal networks operating across state lines required a federal response that local sheriffs could not provide. The model of the private detective agency, the Pinkertons, Wells Fargo's operatives, the various range detective associations hired by cattlemen, established precedents for private security that remain deeply embedded in American legal and commercial culture. And there is something else worth noting, something that connects the frontier directly to the present, the fundamental tension in frontier law enforcement between the need for order and the inadequacy of the resources allocated to achieve it, between the formal law and the informal networks that actually made society function, between justice as an ideal and justice as it was actually practiced. That tension did not disappear when the Census Bureau declared the frontier closed in 1890. It just moved. It moved into the cities, into the labor conflicts of the industrial era, into the civil rights struggles of the 20th century. The question of who the law serves, and how it actually catches the people it is looking for, and what it costs to build a society where that question has a decent answer, that is not a frontier question. That is the American question, and we are still working on it. What happened in those dusty, violent, legally ambiguous decades between the end of the Civil War and the turn of the century was not simply the taming of a wild land. It was the working out in blood and telegraph wire and court documents and informants' whispers of what kind of country this was going to be. The sheriffs and the outlaws were both products of the same conditions, the same land hunger, the same institutional chaos, the same conviction that rules were for other people. The difference between them was often thinner than the mythology admits. Pat Garrett was shot and killed in 1908 in a dispute over a land lease, not by an outlaw, but by a business rival. Wyatt Earp lived to 1929, outlasting almost everyone from the Tombstone years, and spent his final decades trying to get Hollywood to tell his story correctly, with limited success. Bass Reeves died peacefully in 1910, his name largely forgotten until recent decades began the long work of recovering it. The frontier is over. The trackers and the tracked are all gone, but the methods they invented, the networks they built, the compromises they made, and the questions they left unanswered are still shaping the country they left behind. And that more than any gunfight or jailbreak is the story worth telling.